2 years after Tupac Shakur's death, a song climbs the Billboard charts. Not a gangster rap anthem, not a diss track, not another piece of the East Coast-West Coast war that killed him. This is different. Changes is reaching soccer moms in suburban Minnesota, playing on pop radio stations that never touched hip-hop before, bringing tears to the eyes of people who dismissed Tupac as just another angry rapper. It's sampling a white artist from the 1980s. It's talking about racism, poverty, police brutality, and the struggle to survive in America. And it's becoming the song that defines Tupac Shakur's legacy, the proof that beneath the rage and the violence and the headlines, there was a poet, a philosopher, a young man who understood injustice and wanted desperately to change it. But Tupac never heard changes on the radio, never saw the music video that made him a global icon, never knew that the song he recorded in a studio session years earlier would become his biggest mainstream success. He was 2 years dead when the world finally understood what he'd been trying to say all along. Some artists spend their whole lives chasing a hit. Tupac recorded his without even knowing it would be released. Changes wasn't new when it came out in 1998. The vocals were recorded in 1992 during the sessions for Tupac's breakthrough album Tupacalypse Now and possibly strictly for My Niggaz. The beat was different then, darker, harder, more in line with the militant sound Tupac was known for in the early 90s. But even in that original version, the message was clear. Tupac was 21 years old, already exhausted by the cycle of violence and poverty that consumed black communities across America. Already angry at a system that seemed designed to keep his people down, already searching for answers that nobody in power wanted to give. The lyrics of Changes came from a place deeper than most of Tupac's work. This wasn't performance. This wasn't the thug life persona that would later define him in the media. This was Tupac Shakur, the son of Black Panther revolutionaries, raised on stories of resistance and systemic oppression. Tupac, the kid who'd gone to Baltimore School for the Arts and studied theater and poetry. Tupac, the young man who understood that his music could be more than entertainment. It could be testimony, documentation, a record of what it felt like to be young, black, and hopeless in 1990s America. The original recording of Changes sat in vaults for years. Tupac moved on to other projects, other albums, other battles. He signed with Death Row Records in 1995 and became a different version of himself, angrier, more aggressive, more focused on the beef with Biggie and Bad Boy than on the social commentary that had once defined his work. By the time he died in September 1996, Changes was a forgotten track, something he'd recorded when he was younger and less famous, something that didn't fit the death row image of Tupac as a warrior, a gangster, a man at war with the world. But after his death, the people managing Tupac's estate started going through unreleased material, looking for songs that could be completed, remixed and released to a public hungry for new Tupac music. And someone found Changes, heard the vocals, understood that the message was timeless, and decided to do something unprecedented, take a hardcore rap vocal from 1992 and give it a completely different musical foundation, something softer, something that could reach people who would never listen to gangster rap, something that would make Tupac accessible to the mainstream without compromising the power of his words. What would Tupac have thought if he'd known his most militant lyrics would be packaged with a gentle piano melody and released to pop radio? Would he have approved, or would he have seen it as a betrayal of everything he stood for? The man who made Changes possible was a white musician named Bruce Hornsby. In 1986, Hornsby and his band The Range released a song called The Way It Is, a piano-driven ballad about social injustice, economic inequality, and the long, slow struggle for civil rights in America. It was a massive hit, reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. And though Hornsby was white and his sound was distinctly different from hip-hop, his lyrics carried a weight that resonated across racial lines. The Way It Is was about the same systems of oppression that Tupac would spend his career rapping about. It was about how little had changed since the civil rights movement, how laws on paper didn't mean justice in practice, how people were still fighting battles that should have been won decades ago. 12 years later, in 1998, the producers working on Tupac's posthumous material decided to sample The Way It Is as the foundation for Changes. They kept Bruce Hornsby's iconic piano riff, instantly recognizable to anyone who'd lived through the 80s. They added a subtle hip-hop beat underneath, and they laid Tupac's raw, unfiltered vocals on top. The result was something that had never existed in hip-hop before, a perfect fusion of two generations, two genres, two perspectives on the same American tragedy. Bruce Hornsby singing about how things never change, Tupac rapping about why they never change, and both of them across time and race and musical style telling the same truth. Bruce Hornsby himself later said he was honored that his song had been used in Changes. He understood what Tupac was trying to do, and he recognized that his 1986 ballad and Tupac's 1992 rap were saying the same thing in different languages. But here's what most people don't know. Tupac had been a fan of The Way It Is when it first came out. People who knew him in the late 80s, before he was famous, recalled him talking about that song, about how it captured something essential about American inequality, about how a white artist had managed to speak truth that many white Americans needed to hear. And now, years after Tupac's death, that same song was giving his words a platform they'd never had when he was alive. The remixed version of Changes was released in October 1998 as part of the Greatest Hits compilation, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Radio stations that had never played Tupac before added it to rotation. MTV put the music video in heavy circulation, and suddenly, people who'd dismissed Tupac as a violent gangster rapper were listening to his words and realizing he wasn't just angry, he was prophetic. Everything he'd said in 1992 was still true in 1998. The war on drugs was still destroying black communities. Police brutality was still rampant. Poverty was still generational. And the people in power were still pretending that everything was fine. Changes proved what Tupac had been saying all along. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. And the people it's designed to crush are still waiting for someone to care. The music video for Changes was directed by a filmmaker who understood that this song needed to be treated differently from Tupac's other work. No gangster imagery, no death row branding, no shots of Los Angeles streets, or lowriders, or armed men in bandanas. Instead, the video was a collage of documentary footage, images of poverty, of protests, of police violence, of children growing up in neighborhoods where hope was a luxury most families couldn't afford. Interspersed with these images were clips of Tupac himself performing the song in what looked like rehearsal footage or intimate studio sessions. His face was serious, tired, vulnerable. This wasn't the Tupac from Hit 'Em Up. This was the Tupac who'd written poetry about roses growing from concrete, who'd studied Shakespeare and Machiavelli, who'd wanted to be more than just another dead rapper. The video also included something unprecedented, footage of Tupac as a child, photos of him with his mother, Afeni Shakur, during her Black Panther days, images of a young boy who hadn't yet become Tupac, who didn't know that his life would be defined by violence and fame and an early death. The juxtaposition was devastating. Here was proof that Tupac hadn't been born a thug. He'd been born into a system that gave him limited options and then punished him for the choices he made. And Changes was his attempt to explain that system to a world that wanted to ignore it. The song's commercial success shocked the music industry. It peaked at number 32 on the Billboard Hot 100, far higher than most of Tupac's explicitly hip-hop tracks. It went top 10 in multiple countries, including the UK, Germany, and Australia. And it introduced Tupac to demographics that had never engaged with his music before. Older listeners who remembered Bruce Hornsby's original song, white suburban audiences who wouldn't touch gangster rap but found Changes safe and meaningful, international fans who saw in Tupac's lyrics a reflection of their own struggles with inequality and injustice. But the success came with controversy. Some of Tupac's core fans felt betrayed. They saw Changes as a sanitized version of their hero, Tupac, with the edges sanded off, made palatable for people who dismissed him when he was alive. They argued that the pop-friendly production betrayed the rawness of the original recording, that Tupac would never have approved of his militant message being packaged with a soft piano ballad, that the people profiting from his death were turning him into something he'd fought against, a commodity designed to make white audiences comfortable. Behind the scenes, there were fierce debates about how to handle Tupac's posthumous releases. His mother, Afeni Shakur, had taken control of his estate after his death. She was protective of his legacy, but also practical about the financial realities. Tupac had died with debts, legal battles, contracts that tied up his music in ways that made it difficult to profit from his work. and Afeni understood that songs like Changes, songs that could reach mainstream audiences, were key to securing her son's financial legacy and ensuring that his message would outlive the violence that had consumed him. But not everyone agreed with her approach. Death Row Records, which still held rights to much of Tupac's Death Row-era material, wanted to keep releasing aggressive, confrontational tracks. They wanted to maintain the image of Tupac as a warrior, a soldier, a man who died in the middle of a war. Afeni wanted to show the other side, the poet, the activist, the young man who'd cared deeply about his community and wanted to see real change. Changes was her vision of what Tupac's legacy should be, and the song's success proved she was right. The tragedy of Changes is that it took Tupac's death for the world to listen. When he was alive, saying the same things with the same passion, he was dismissed as angry and dangerous. Dead, he became a prophet. Afeni Shakur rarely gave interviews after her son's death. The grief was too raw, the media attention too intrusive. But in the few interviews she did give, she often talked about Changes as the song that best represented who Tupac really was. Not the thug life persona, not the death row warrior, but the son she'd raised, the boy who'd asked questions about injustice when he was 6 years old, who'd written poetry about pain and hope, who'd wanted to use his voice to make the world better for people who looked like him. In a 2001 interview, Afeni was asked what she thought Tupac would have said if he'd known Changes would become his biggest mainstream hit. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said he would have been surprised, maybe a little conflicted, because Tupac wanted to reach people, but he didn't want to compromise. He didn't want to be safe. And Changes is a safe song in some ways. It's the Tupac that white America could handle, the Tupac that doesn't threaten them, but it's also the Tupac I knew best. The one who cried when he saw injustice, who wanted so badly to fix things that he destroyed himself trying. That tension between the Tupac who wanted to change the world and the Tupac who felt he had to be hard enough to survive it runs through everything he created. Changes captures one side of that tension, the hopeful side, the side that believed change was possible if people just opened their eyes and saw the truth. But even in Changes, there's exhaustion, there's frustration, there's the sense that Tupac had been fighting this battle his entire life and was running out of energy. The opening lines of Changes set the tone. I see no changes, wake up in the morning and I ask myself, is life worth living? Should I blast myself? This wasn't metaphor, this was a 21-year-old man genuinely questioning whether life in America as a black man was worth the pain. And 6 years after recording those words, Tupac would be dead, not by his own hand, but by a system that had been killing young black men like him for generations. The song's chorus, taken directly from Bruce Hornsby's original, repeated the phrase, "That's just the way it is." And there's something deeply tragic about that refrain, because it suggests resignation, acceptance, the idea that some things never change because they're too deeply embedded in the structure of society to be fixed. Tupac spent his whole life fighting against that resignation, refusing to accept the way it is, demanding that people see the injustice and do something about it. But by 1992, when he recorded Changes, even he was starting to feel the weight of futility, starting to wonder if anything he said or did would actually matter. The second verse of Changes talks about the war on drugs, police brutality, and the cycle of poverty that traps generation after generation. Tupac raps, "I'm tired of being poor and even worse, I'm black, sla. My stomach hurts, so I'm looking for a purse to snatch." This was sociology, criminology, an explanation of how desperation creates crime, how systems of oppression force people into choices they'd never make if they had real options. But when Tupac was alive, mainstream America didn't want to hear these explanations. They wanted simple narratives, good guys and bad guys, criminals and victims, personal responsibility and law and order. It took his death and a soft piano melody for those same words to reach people who'd refused to listen before. And that's the real tragedy of Changes. Not that it was released posthumously, but that Tupac's message was only palatable to mainstream audiences when it was wrapped in something familiar and non-threatening, when it came with Bruce Hornsby's piano instead of a hard hip-hop beat, when it was framed as a tribute to a dead artist instead of a challenge from a living one. Changes is a beautiful song, but its success is an indictment. It proves that America was willing to mourn Tupac, but not to listen to him when he was alive and demanding that they change. The success of Changes in 1998 sparked a larger conversation about Tupac's legacy. Was he a gangster rapper, a revolutionary, a poet, a victim, a villain? And how should his music be remembered, as documentation of a violent era or as timeless social commentary that transcended the circumstances of his death? Different people had different answers, and those answers often said more about the people giving them than about Tupac himself. For young Black Americans who'd grown up with Tupac's music, Changes was vindication, proof that Tupac had always been more than the media's portrayal of him, that his anger came from a place of love for his community and frustration with a system that refused to acknowledge its failures. They saw Changes as Tupac's real voice, the voice he used when he wasn't performing for death row or battling the East Coast or defending himself against charges that he was glorifying violence. For older civil rights activists, people who'd marched with Dr. King, who'd been part of the Black Panther movement, who'd fought battles for equality in the 60s and 70s, Changes was bittersweet, because Tupac was singing about the same issues they'd dedicated their lives to solving, the same police brutality, the same economic inequality, the same systemic racism, and the fact that a 21-year-old in 1992 was still facing those battles proved that the civil rights movement, for all its victories, had left fundamental structures of oppression intact. Bruce Hornsby's original lyrics included the line, "They passed a law in '64 to give those who ain't got a little more, but it ain't me, babe. No, 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 it's you." The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was supposed to be a turning point, but as both Hornsby in 1986 and Tupac in 1992 understood, laws on paper don't automatically translate to justice in practice. Segregation didn't end, it just became more subtle. Economic inequality didn't disappear, it got worse, and the promise of equality that America claimed to offer remained unfulfilled for millions of people born into the wrong neighborhoods, the wrong families, the wrong skin color. Changes became an anthem for people who felt that exhaustion, who were tired of fighting battles that should have been won long ago, who wanted to believe in progress but kept running into the same walls their parents and grandparents had faced. And the song's massive success, its ability to reach across demographic lines and touch people from different backgrounds, proved that these weren't just Black issues or urban issues, they were American issues, human issues, and pretending otherwise was just another way of avoiding the truth. The music video for Changes won awards. The song was nominated for a Grammy. It became one of the most licensed tracks in Tupac's catalog, used in films, commercials, and documentaries about social justice. And with each use, Tupac's message reached new audiences, people who'd never heard of Death Row Records, people who didn't know about the East Coast-West Coast War, people who just heard a song about inequality and recognized their own frustrations in Tupac's words. In death, Tupac became the prophet he'd been trying to be in life, but prophets aren't supposed to die at 25. They're supposed to live long enough to see if their prophecies come true. 27 years after Tupac's death, Changes remains his most enduring song, not California Love, not Dear Mama, not Hit 'Em Up or any of the confrontational tracks that defined his death row era. Changes, a song he recorded at 21 and never heard become a hit, is the song that most people associate with his legacy, and that tells you something about what the world wanted from Tupac. They wanted the poet, not the warrior, the philosopher, not the gangster, the young man asking hard questions about injustice, not the man who'd given up on peaceful solutions and chosen violence. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Tupac was both. He was the poet and the warrior, the philosopher and the gangster, the young man searching for answers, and the man who decided there were no answers, only survival. And you can't separate those pieces without losing something essential about who he was. Changes shows one side of Tupac, Hit 'Em Up shows another, and both are authentic, both are real, both are part of a complex human being who was shaped by trauma, poverty, systemic racism, and the impossible pressures of fame. The question that haunts Changes is this: would the song have been a hit if Tupac had released it himself in 1992? If it had come out on strictly For My NIGGAZ with a harder beat and no Bruce Hornsby sample, would mainstream America have listened? Or was Tupac's message only acceptable after he was dead, when he couldn't challenge people anymore, couldn't demand that they do more than just listen sympathetically. Afeni Shakur believed that Tupac would have wanted changes to be heard, that he would have approved of the remix, the soft production, the mainstream success, because it meant his words were reaching people who needed to hear them. But some of Tupac's friends from his militant days weren't so sure. They thought Tupac had spent his whole life refusing to be palatable to white audiences, refusing to soften his message or make himself safe. And they saw changes as a posthumous compromise, Tupac's estate making him acceptable in ways he'd never been willing to be when he was alive. The truth is, we'll never know what Tupac would have thought. He didn't get to decide how his legacy would be shaped. That decision was made by the people he left behind, people who loved him, but who had their own agendas, their own visions of who he should be remembered as. Changes is beautiful because it's hopeful, because even in its exhaustion, even in its frustration, it suggests that things could be different, that the systems causing so much pain aren't inevitable, that if people just opened their eyes and chose to see what was happening, they might choose to fix it. Tupac wanted to believe that, spent his whole life wanting to believe that. And in 1992, at 21 years old, he still had enough hope left to record a song suggesting that change was possible. By 1996, that hope was gone, replaced by rage, paranoia, and the certainty that the system would never let him, or anyone who looked like him, win. Hit 'em up is what happened when hope died. Changes is what Tupac sounded like when he still thought there was a chance. And the fact that Changes became his biggest mainstream hit after his death is both a tribute and an indictment. A tribute to the power of his words, an indictment of a world that only listened after it was too late. Tupac Shakur recorded Changes in 1992. He died in 1996. The song was released in 1998. And in 2025, 27 years after its release, the lyrics are still true. Police brutality still happens. Poverty is still generational. The war on drugs is still destroying communities. And young black men are still asking themselves the same question Tupac asked: is life worth living? That's not Tupac's failure, that's ours. Because he told us what needed to change, he gave us the roadmap, and we chose to make him a legend instead of listening to what he was actually saying. Changes was Tupac's gift to the world. The world made it a eulogy. And the systems he died fighting against are still here, still grinding, still making sure that nothing really changes at all. If Tupac had lived to see Changes become a massive hit, do you think he would have embraced it or felt it was a compromise of his message? What do you think he'd say about the fact that we're still fighting the same battles he rapped about in 1992? Drop your thoughts below. The most insightful perspectives get pinned. Next video. Before the fame, before death row, before the legend, Tupac was a backup dancer, the digital underground story you've never heard.